There is a name that never screamed for attention. No headlines calling him public enemy number one. No garish nickname splashed across tabloids like some of his contemporaries. While Lucky Luciano charmed the cameras and Al Capone posed for photographers in tailored suits, one man built an empire so quiet, so surgically precise, that even the FBI struggled for decades to understand exactly how powerful he truly was. They called him Three-Finger Brown, name born from a childhood accident, not a mafia legend. But behind that almost comical nickname stood a mind so calculating, so patient, that he would come to control one of the most feared crime families in American history and die of natural causes, in his own bed, having never spent a single day in prison for the empire he built. This is the story of Gaetano Lucchese, the Quiet Dawn, the man who understood that in a world of gunfire and headlines, silence was the deadliest weapon of all. Before we descend into the shadows of Prohibition-era New York, into tenement basements where fortunes and lives were decided in whispers, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? And what time is it right now as you press play? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and there's something strange and wonderful about knowing this story is being told to people scattered across 100 different cities, 100 different time zones. All of us gathered here in the dark for the same reason, to understand the men who built empires in the shadows of the American dream. Now settle in. Turn the lights down if you can. This is the story of a boy who lost 2 fingers in a factory accident and grew up to lose nothing else. Not his freedom, not his family, not his grip on power. For over half a century, the tenements of East Harlem in the early 1900s did not forgive weakness. They were narrow, airless corridors of brick and desperation, stacked 5 and 6 stories high, where entire families crowded into 2 or 3 rooms, and the stench of coal smoke mixed with the smell of garlic and boiled cabbage drifting from every window. It was into this world, on December 1, 1902, that Gaetano Lucchese was born, not in America, but in Palermo, Sicily, the ancient island that had, for centuries, bred both saints and killers in equal measure. Sometimes within the same family, Sicily in those years was a land haunted by its own history. The Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, as it would later be known to the world, was not yet the sprawling international criminal network it would become. It was something older, something rooted in the soil itself. A code of silence. Omerta, born from centuries of foreign occupation, from Sicilians learning that the law was never truly on their side, that justice was something you built yourself, in the dark, among men you trusted with your life. Gaetano's family were not wealthy. They were not connected to the old Sicilian crime families in any significant way, at least not yet. His father worked with his hands, as most men in Palermo did, and young Gaetano grew up watching the adults around him navigate a world where survival meant knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to smile and when to disappear. But Sicily was dying economically, if not spiritually. Poverty gripped the island like a fever that would not break. Crop failures, overpopulation, and the crushing weight of feudal land structures left millions of Sicilians with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and the promise, however uncertain, of something better across the ocean. Between 1900 and 1910, more than 2 million Italians would make the crossing to America, cramped into the steerage decks of ships, seasick and terrified and hopeful all at once. The Lucchese family was one of these waves. Sometime in Gaetano's early childhood, the exact year remains debated among historians, some placing it as early as 1904 or 1905. The family boarded a ship bound for New York Harbor, leaving behind the only world they had ever known for a city that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. Imagine, for a moment, what that crossing must have felt like for a small child. The Atlantic Ocean, stretching endlessly in every direction, gray and merciless. The cramped, filthy conditions below decks, where hundreds of immigrants slept shoulder to shoulder. The air, thick with the smell of vomit and unwashed bodies. The constant fear of disease sweeping through the hold like a rumor nobody could stop. And then, finally, the sight that made grown men weep and children stare in silent wonder. The Statue of Liberty rising out of the harbor mist, her torch held high, a promise carved in copper and iron, for the Lucchese family. As for millions of others, that statue represented hope. What none of them could have known was that the city waiting behind her would offer a very different kind of promise to a boy like Gaetano. Not the promise of honest opportunity, but the promise that in America, just as in Sicily, the world would always belong to those willing to take it. East Harlem, where the family eventually settled, was already becoming one of the largest Italian immigrant communities in the United States, a place the locals would come to call Italian Harlem. The streets were a chaotic symphony of pushcart vendors hawking fruit and fish, women shouting to children in Sicilian dialect from tenement windows, the clatter of horse-drawn carts giving way slowly to the rumble of early automobiles. It was a world unto itself, insulated from the rest of Manhattan by language, culture, and a deep, generational mistrust of American institutions, the police, the courts, the government, all of which had, in the immigrants' experience, never protected people like them, and often actively persecuted them instead. For a young boy trying to find his footing in this new world, school offered little refuge. Gaetano, like most immigrant children of his generation, left formal education early. Some accounts suggest he never advanced beyond a few years of elementary schooling and went to work as soon as he was able, contributing to a family that desperately needed every dollar he could bring home. It was during these formative years, sometime in his early teens, that the event occurred which would define his public nickname for the rest of his life, and long after his death. The details vary slightly depending on the source, but the essential tragedy remains the same. While working, some accounts say in a factory, others suggest it happened during manual labor on the docks or in a workshop. Young Gaetano suffered a horrific accident. Machinery caught his right hand, and by the time he was pulled free, 2 fingers had been severed. There was no advanced trauma surgery waiting for him, no modern reconstructive medicine. He was simply patched up as best the doctors of the era could manage, sent home to heal, and forced to adapt to a hand that would never again be whole. For most people, such an injury might have been a source of shame, something to hide, a physical reminder of vulnerability in a world that respected only strength. But the streets of East Harlem had their own brutal sense of humor, and soon enough, the local boys had given him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Three-Finger Brown. The name was a reference, bitterly ironic, given the circumstances, to Mordecai Three-Finger Brown, the famous Chicago Cubs pitcher of the era, who had lost fingers in a childhood farming accident and gone on to become one of the greatest pitchers in baseball history. Despite, or perhaps because of, his unusual grip on the ball, it was meant, in the strange logic of street culture, almost as a compliment. This kid lost his fingers too. And look at him, still standing, still moving, still dangerous. And dangerous he would become. Because East Harlem in the 1910s and 1922 was not simply a community of hardworking immigrants, it was also becoming fertile ground for organized crime. As young Sicilian and Italian men, locked out of legitimate opportunity by discrimination, poverty, and a justice system that viewed them with suspicion at best and outright hostility at worst, turned instead to the underground economy that was rapidly forming beneath the surface of New York City. Gaetano's entry into this world was not marked by some singular, dramatic event, no one moment where he chose crime over an honest life in some cinematic crossroads. Rather, it was a gradual immersion, the way a boy raised near the water learns to swim, not through formal lessons, but simply by being constantly near the current. He ran errands for local gamblers. He learned which streets belonged to which crews, which shopkeepers paid protection, and which resisted. He watched the older men, the ones who wore better suits than their honest neighbors could ever afford, who commanded respect with a glance rather than a raised voice. And he began to understand, with the clear-eyed pragmatism that would define his entire life, that there were 2 paths available to a poor Sicilian boy in New York City: the path of grinding, invisible poverty, or the path of the underworld, where a sharp mind and a willingness to take risks could translate into real power. By his late teens, Gaetano had already accumulated a minor criminal record: arrests for car theft and other petty offenses that were, in many ways, simply the entry-level curriculum of the New York underworld in that era. Car theft, in particular, was booming. The automobile was still new enough, and law enforcement's ability to track and recover stolen vehicles primitive enough, that stealing cars represented one of the most accessible and lucrative criminal enterprises available to ambitious young men without connections or capital. Gaetano proved himself capable in this world. Not flashy or reckless, but methodical. He learned quickly, he kept his mouth shut when questioned, and critically, he began to build relationships with older, more established figures in the emerging Italian-American underworld, relationships that would prove far more valuable than any single criminal score. Then came 1920, and with it, a single piece of federal legislation that would transform the American underworld more completely than any mob boss ever could: the Volstead Act. And the beginning of Prohibition. It is difficult, from the vantage point of the modern world, to fully appreciate what Prohibition meant for the men who would come to dominate organized crime in America. Overnight, the United States government had criminalized one of the most popular and profitable commodities in the country, alcohol, while doing absolutely nothing to diminish the public's appetite for it. Speakeasies flourished behind unmarked doors. Bathtub gin and smuggled Canadian whiskey flowed through cities from coast to coast. And somebody had to supply it. Somebody had to manufacture it, transport it, distribute it, and protect it from both the police and rival criminal organizations who wanted a piece of the enormously profitable trade. For the young men of the Italian underworld, many of them, like Gaetano, still in their late teens or early 20s, Prohibition was less a moral crisis and more the greatest business opportunity in American history. Here was an entire industry, worth untold millions of dollars, that the government had essentially handed to organized crime by making it illegal. And in New York City, where the concentration of both wealthy clientele and immigrant labor created ideal conditions, the bootlegging trade exploded almost overnight into a sprawling, violent, and enormously lucrative enterprise. Gaetano threw himself into this world with the same quiet determination that had characterized his approach to car theft. He was not, by temperament, a man who sought the spotlight. He did not crave the flamboyant lifestyle that some of his contemporaries pursued: the garish suits, the public displays of wealth, the newspaper headlines. Instead, he focused on something far more valuable in the long run: relationships, logistics, and reliability. In the chaotic, often brutally violent world of Prohibition-era bootlegging, where rival gangs regularly settled disputes with gunfire in broad daylight, a man who could be trusted to deliver product on time, to keep his word, and to keep his mouth shut when arrested, was worth far more than a man who was simply willing to pull a trigger. It was during these years that Gaetano's path began to intersect more directly with the established Italian-American crime families that were consolidating power across New York City. The landscape of organized crime in this era was still fluid, still forming into the structure that would later be formalized as the Five Families. Various crews and factions, many organized along lines of Sicilian regional origin or personal loyalty to specific older bosses, competed and cooperated in shifting patterns of alliance. Gaetano found himself drawn into the orbit of Gaetano Tommy Reina, a powerful figure who controlled a significant faction within the East Harlem and Bronx underworld, one of the organizations that would eventually evolve into what became known as the Lucchese crime family itself. Though it would carry other names before Gaetano's own, Reina was, by the standards of the era, a relatively cautious and business-minded boss, less interested in flamboyant violence than in building a stable, profitable criminal enterprise centered heavily on the ice distribution business, a surprisingly lucrative racket in an era before most working-class households had electric refrigeration. When blocks of ice were an essential daily commodity for food preservation across the sweltering tenements of New York City, Alongside the ice trade, Raina's organization was deeply involved in bootlegging, gambling, and the beginnings of labor racketeering, the practice of infiltrating labor unions to extract kickbacks, control hiring, and manipulate entire industries through the threat of strikes and violence. For a young man like Gaetano, entering this organization was an education in the true architecture of organized crime. Not the cartoonish gunfights that would later dominate Hollywood's imagination, but the patient, methodical construction of parallel economic power, built on relationships, fear, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. He rose within this structure, not through spectacular acts of violence, but through demonstrated competence and unwavering discretion. He understood, perhaps earlier and more clearly than many of his contemporaries, that the men who survived and thrived in this world over the long term were not necessarily the most violent or the most feared, but the ones who never gave the authorities a reason or the evidence to destroy them. This philosophy would define Gaetano Lucchese for the rest of his life, and it stood in stark contrast to many of the men who would become his contemporaries and eventually his fellow bosses. While figures like Al Capone courted publicity, believing that fame itself was a form of protection, and while others in the emerging Mafia hierarchy engaged in reckless, headline-grabbing violence, Gaetano cultivated something rarer and, ultimately, far more durable: invisibility. He learned to move through the criminal world the way a shadow moves through a room. Present, undeniable in its effects, but almost impossible to grasp. By the mid-1920s, as Prohibition entered its most chaotic and violent phase, with rival bootlegging operations across New York engaging in periodic but brutal turf wars, Gaetano had established himself as a trusted and capable lieutenant within Raina's organization. He was not yet a household name, even within the underworld itself. That recognition would come later, forged in the fires of a conflict that would reshape the entire structure of the American Mafia. But he had already begun to develop the qualities that would eventually carry him to the very top of one of New York's most powerful crime families: patience, discretion, an instinct for building alliances rather than enemies, and an almost supernatural ability to remain several steps removed from the violence that so often destroyed his more reckless peers. What none of them could have predicted, not Gaetano, not Raina, not any of the young, ambitious men climbing the ranks of the New York underworld in those years, was that within just a few short years, the entire structure of organized crime in America would be violently, permanently transformed by a conflict so brutal it would come to be known as the Castellammarese War. It would claim the lives of dozens of men, reshape the balance of power across every major crime family in the city, and ultimately create the very system, the five families, the commission, the modern American Mafia, as history would come to understand it, within which Gaetano Lucchese would eventually rise to become one of the most powerful and most quietly enduring dons in the history of American organized crime. By 1930, the fragile peace that had allowed New York's Italian underworld to prosper quietly through the bootlegging boom of the 1920s was beginning to crack. Beneath the surface of speakeasies and ice trucks and gambling parlors, a deeper tension had been building for years, a tension rooted not in business disputes, but in something older and more tribal: the divide between two distinct waves and factions of Sicilian and Italian immigrants who had settled in New York, each bringing with them different loyalties, different regional identities, and increasingly, competing visions of who should control the rapidly expanding criminal empire that Prohibition had built. On one side stood the old guard, men like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, a heavy-set, physically imposing boss who had clawed his way to dominance over much of the New York underworld through sheer aggression and a willingness to eliminate rivals without hesitation. Masseria represented what many of the younger, more Americanized gangsters saw as an outdated model of leadership, one rooted in old-world Sicilian hierarchy, rigid tradition, and a demand for absolute, unquestioning loyalty that left little room for the kind of business-minded pragmatism that men like Lucky Luciano and, increasingly, Gaetano Lucchese himself believed was the future of organized crime in America. On the other side stood Salvatore Maranzano, a cultured, ambitious boss recently arrived from Sicily with deep connections to the old Sicilian mafia structure, and crucially enormous ambition to not simply run a criminal faction, but to become the singular, supreme boss of an entire unified American underworld, modeled explicitly on ancient hierarchies of Sicily itself, complete with formal titles, structured chains of command, and an almost feudal sense of absolute authority. Caught between these two towering egos were dozens of smaller factions and crews across New York City, each forced, eventually, to choose sides or risk being crushed between the two colliding empires. Gaetano Reina, the boss under whom young Gaetano Lucchese had spent the better part of a decade learning the intricate mechanics of organized crime, found himself in an increasingly dangerous position. Reina's territory, his lucrative ice monopoly, and his growing bootlegging operations made him a valuable prize. And Joe Masiria, never a man inclined toward diplomacy, began pressuring Reina to hand over an increasing share of his profits as tribute, a demand that grew more aggressive and more humiliating with each passing month. For a young, rising figure like Gaetano, watching this unfold from within Reina's own organization, the lesson was unmistakable and would shape the rest of his career. Loyalty in this world was never permanent, and the men who survived were the ones who could read the shifting tides of power before those around them even realized the water was moving. Reina, sensing the writing on the wall, had begun secretly negotiating with Maranzano's faction, the Castellammarese, named for the Sicilian coastal town of Castellammarese del Golfo, from which many of Maranzano's most loyal soldiers originated, hoping to find protection against Masiria's escalating demands. Masiria's intelligence network, however, was not to be underestimated. On February 26, 1930, Gaetano Reina left a card game at a social club in the Bronx and was gunned down on the street by a shotgun blast, an assassination almost certainly ordered by Masiria himself, either as punishment for Reina's suspected disloyalty or simply to eliminate an increasingly independent boss and absorb his lucrative ice and bootlegging operations directly into Masiria's own expanding empire. The murder of Reina sent shockwaves through his organization, and it was in the chaotic, dangerous aftermath of this assassination that the war which would come to define an entire generation of American organized crime, the Castellammarese War, truly ignited in full. Reina's former crew fractured under the pressure. Some members, out of fear or opportunism, aligned themselves with Masiria, accepting the new boss Masiria installed to run the organization, a man named Joseph Pinzolo, who had little real connection to the crew and was widely resented as an outside imposition. Gaetano Lucchese, along with several other key figures within the organization, men who would go on to become legendary names in American organized crime history, including a rising, whip-smart young gangster named Tommaso Gagliano, refused to simply accept Masiria's puppet boss. What followed was a period of extraordinarily dangerous double-dealing, one that reveals perhaps more about Gaetano's true character and capabilities than any other episode of his early career. Publicly, Gaetano and his allies within the old Reina crew maintained an appearance of grudging cooperation with Pinzolo and, by extension, with Masiria's authority. Privately, they were doing something far more dangerous, secretly negotiating and aligning themselves with Salvatore Maranzano's Castellammarese faction, positioning themselves to strike against Masiria's control of their former organization the moment an opportunity presented itself. This was not a decision made lightly, nor without enormous personal risk. In the paranoid, blood-soaked atmosphere of the Castellammarese War, being discovered as a secret defector to the opposing faction meant certain death, often preceded by torture to extract the names of co-conspirators. The opportunity came in September of 1930. Joseph Pinzolo, Masiria's installed boss over the former Reina organization, was lured to a meeting at an office in the Brokaw building near Times Square under the pretense of routine business. There, he was shot to death. While the historical record on exactly who pulled the trigger remains debated among historians and researchers of this era, as is so often the case with mob killings from this period, where the code of omerta ensured that few reliable first-hand accounts ever surfaced, what is clear is that the assassination was orchestrated by the faction of the old Reina crew that had secretly aligned with Maranzano, a faction in which Gaetano Lucchese played an increasingly central and trusted role. With Pinzolo eliminated, leadership of the former Reina organization fell to Tommaso Gagliano, who would go on to serve as the family's boss for the next 2 decades. With Gaetano Lucchese serving as one of his most trusted and capable lieutenants, a partnership built not on flashy displays of loyalty, but on Gaetano's now well-established reputation for discretion, competence, and an almost eerie ability to navigate the treacherous currents of underworld politics without ever leaving fingerprints, literal or figurative, that could be traced back to him. The broader Castellammarese War raged on for many more months, a conflict marked by ambushes, betrayals, and assassinations carried out across the boroughs of New York City, as Maseria's forces and Maranzano's forces bled each other in a brutal contest for supremacy over the entire structure of Italian-American organized crime. But the war's most consequential turn was not, ultimately, decided on the streets through open combat. It was decided through betrayal, a betrayal orchestrated not by Maranzano's forces directly, but by a faction within Maseria's own inner circle, who had grown convinced that their boss's stubborn, old-world approach to leadership was going to get them all killed, and that the future belonged to a very different kind of organization entirely. Chief among these disillusioned lieutenants was Charles Lucky Luciano, Maseria's own trusted underboss, who had secretly begun negotiating with Maranzano's faction, offering to eliminate Masseria himself in exchange for peace, an end to the increasingly costly war, and crucially a guaranteed position of power within whatever new structure emerged from the conflict's resolution. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at a restaurant in Coney Island, ostensibly a peace gesture between the two men, an attempt to smooth over tensions. The two men ate, played cards, and shared what appeared to be an amicable afternoon together. Then Luciano excused himself to the restroom. In his absence, several gunmen entered the restaurant and shot Giuseppe Masseria to death at the table where he sat, the cards from their game reportedly still scattered across the tablecloth. The most powerful boss in New York's Italian underworld was dead, killed on the orders of his own trusted lieutenant, in a betrayal so complete and so perfectly executed that it would become one of the most legendary assassinations in American organized crime history. With Masseria eliminated, the Castellammarese War came to its formal conclusion, and Salvatore Maranzano emerged as the victor, the supreme boss of what he now declared to be a unified, restructured Italian-American underworld across New York City. It was Maranzano who, in the aftermath of this bloody conflict, formally established the organizational structure that would come to define American organized crime for the rest of the 20th century, the division of New York's underworld into what became known as the Five Families, each with its own defined territory, its own boss, underboss, and capos, operating under a shared code of conduct and, at least in theory, a shared commitment to avoiding the kind of destructive, citywide warfare that had just torn the underworld apart. Tommaso Gagliano's organization, the former Reina crew, within which Gaetano Lucchese now held a position of significant trust and growing authority, was formally recognized as one of these five families, a lineage of organizational continuity that would eventually, decades later, come to bear Gaetano's own name. But Maranzano's supreme reign proved remarkably short-lived. His ambitions, it turned out, extended far beyond simply organizing the underworld into a stable structure. He envisioned himself as a boss of all bosses, a supreme authority with dictatorial control over all five families, a vision that Luciano and the younger, more business-minded generation of gangsters found intolerable. They had not eliminated Masseria's old-world rigidity simply to replace it with Maranzano's own version of the same autocratic ambition. Within months, Luciano orchestrated Maranzano's assassination as well. In September of 1931, a coldly efficient hit carried out by gunmen posing as police officers and tax investigators who gained entry to Maranzano's office and shot him to death at his desk. With both Masiria and Maranzano now dead, Luciano moved decisively to establish a new structure entirely. Not a single supreme boss ruling over all of organized crime, but a commission governing body composed of the bosses of the 5 families, designed to mediate disputes, sanction major decisions, and prevent exactly the kind of destructive, citywide warfare that had just claimed so many lives. This new structure, pragmatic, business-oriented, focused on stability and profit rather than old-world honor and rigid hierarchy, represented precisely the philosophy that Gaetano Lucchese had quietly embodied throughout his own rise within the underworld. He had never sought the spotlight, never craved the kind of absolute, feared authority that men like Masiria or Maranzano had pursued. He understood, with the clarity that would define the rest of his extraordinary career, that true power in this new American underworld was not measured by how loudly a man could command fear, but by how quietly he could accumulate influence, wealth, and the unshakable trust of the men around him. By the time the dust settled on the Castellammarese War and the new commission structure was established, Gaetano Lucchese had survived a conflict that had claimed dozens of lives, had positioned himself as one of the most trusted lieutenants within Tommaso Gagliano's family, and had demonstrated through the careful, secretive maneuvering that eliminated Pinzolo and secured his faction's alliance with the eventual winning side an almost preternatural political instinct that set him apart from many of his more reckless contemporaries. He was not yet a boss. That position still belonged to Gagliano, who would go on to lead the family through the remainder of the 1930s and into the 1940s with the same cautious, low-profile approach that had defined his own rise. But Gaetano had firmly established himself as the family's future, the man whose counsel Gagliano increasingly relied upon, whose judgment was trusted on matters ranging from business ventures to the delicate, ever-present question of managing relationships with the other 4 families now sharing New York's underworld. Under the new commission's uneasy peace, the 1930 seconds that followed would bring Prohibition's repeal in 1933, a moment that forced every bootlegging operation in America to rapidly diversify or collapse along with the growing shadow of federal law enforcement attention, as figures like Thomas Dewey began building the legal frameworks and prosecutorial strategies that would eventually bring down men like Luciano himself. It would be an era that tested every lesson Gaetano had learned throughout his rise: the value of discretion, the danger of publicity, and the absolute necessity of building an organization structured to survive not just the violence of rival gangs, but the far more patient and dangerous threat of federal prosecution. How Gaetano navigated this new and increasingly perilous landscape, securing his family's future even as Luciano's own empire came crashing down around him, and beginning the long, careful ascent that would eventually place him at the very head of the organization, is the story that awaits us in the chapter to come. Repeal came on December 5, 1933, and with it, an entire economic ecosystem that had sustained the American underworld for more than a decade simply vanished overnight. The 18th Amendment, which had transformed ordinary bootleggers into millionaires and turned street corner thugs into organized businessmen, was gone, and with it went the single most profitable criminal enterprise in the history of the United States. For many of the smaller, less adaptable criminal operations across the country, repeal represented an extinction-level event. Gangs that had built their entire existence around the manufacture and distribution of illegal alcohol simply had nowhere left to turn, and many of them dissolved, their members drifting into legitimate work or smaller-time crime. Unable to replicate the scale of wealth Prohibition had briefly made possible, but for the more sophisticated organizations and Gagliano's family, with Gaetano Lucchese now firmly established as one of its most capable senior figures. was among the most sophisticated. Repeal was not a catastrophe, but a challenge to be met with the same patient, methodical adaptability that had defined the family's survival through the Castellammarese War. The lesson Gaetano had absorbed throughout the previous decade was that no single racket, however profitable, should ever be allowed to become the sole foundation of the organization's power. Diversification was survival. An empire built on one commodity was an empire waiting to collapse the moment that commodity disappeared or was legalized out from under it. And so, throughout the mid to late 1930s, the family under Gagliano's leadership, guided increasingly by Gaetano's own strategic instincts, pivoted decisively into the rackets that would come to define organized crime in America for the next several decades: labor racketeering, loan sharking, illegal gambling operations, and, in a move that would prove particularly significant to Gaetano's personal rise, deep infiltration into New York's garment industry, one of the largest and most economically vital manufacturing sectors in the entire city. The garment district, sprawling across the west side of Manhattan, represented an almost irresistible target for organized crime infiltration. Thousands of small manufacturers, contractors, and subcontractors depended on trucking companies to move fabric, finished garments, and raw materials between factories, warehouses, and retail buyers across the city and beyond. Whoever controlled the trucking, whoever controlled the ability to move goods in and out of the district, held enormous, largely invisible leverage over an entire industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. It was, in many ways, the perfect racket for a man of Gaetano's temperament. Not glamorous, not the stuff of newspaper headlines, but deeply, structurally profitable, and nearly impossible for law enforcement to untangle without an intimate understanding of an incredibly complex industry that even legitimate regulators struggled to fully comprehend. Gaetano began cultivating relationships throughout the trucking and garment industries with the same careful, long-term patience he had applied to every other aspect of his rise. Rather than simply extorting manufacturers through crude threats, the blunt force approach favored by less sophisticated criminal operators, he positioned himself and his associates as problem solvers, as men who could guarantee labor peace, ensure deliveries ran smoothly, and prevent the kind of union strife that could shut down a factory for weeks and bankrupt a small manufacturer overnight. Of course, the labor peace he guaranteed was often labor peace that his own organization had first threatened to disrupt. And the smooth deliveries he ensured were smooth precisely because his organization controlled the trucking routes and could make life extraordinarily difficult for anyone who refused to pay for the privilege of using them. It was extortion, dressed in the language of service, a model that would generate enormous, steady income for the family for decades to come, largely hidden from public view. Precisely because it never generated the kind of dramatic violence that drew newspaper reporters and congressional investigators. This period also saw Gaetano deepen his personal relationships with the other rising powers of New York's underworld, men who, alongside him, would come to define organized crime in America for the next generation. Chief among these was Charles Lucky Luciano himself, now sitting atop his own family and serving as the driving force behind the commission's new structure. Though Gaetano was not part of Luciano's own family, the two men developed a mutual respect rooted in shared philosophy. Both understood that the future of organized crime in America depended not on old-world displays of dominance, but on quiet, business-like efficiency, on minimizing unnecessary violence, and on cultivating the kind of discretion that kept an organization's true scope and power hidden from the prying eyes of prosecutors and the public alike. It was also during these years that Gaetano built what would become one of the most important relationships of his entire career: his connection to Frank Costello, another rising figure within Luciano's orbit, who would eventually become one of the most powerful and politically connected mob bosses in American history. A man so adept at cultivating relationships with judges, politicians, and police officials that he would come to be known with a mixture of admiration and dread. As the prime minister of the underworld, Gaetano's relationship with Costello would prove instrumental in later years, providing a crucial line of communication and cooperation between two of New York's most powerful families, precisely at moments when tension between rival organizations threatened to spill over into open conflict. But even as Gaetano's star continued to rise within Gagliano's organization, the broader landscape of organized crime in New York was entering an increasingly perilous era, one defined not by rival gangsters, but by an ambitious, relentless prosecutor determined to make his political career by systematically dismantling the very underworld structure that Luciano, Gagliano, and Gaetano himself had all worked so hard to build and stabilize. Thomas E. Dewey, appointed as a special prosecutor and later elected district attorney of New York County, represented a fundamentally new kind of threat to organized crime. Not a rival gang with guns and territory, but a meticulous legal mind, backed by the full resources of the state, willing to spend years building complex racketeering and prostitution cases against the city's most powerful mob figures. Dewey's most spectacular success came in 1936, when he successfully prosecuted Lucky Luciano himself on charges of compulsory prostitution, securing a conviction that would send Luciano to prison for decades and permanently alter the leadership structure of his family, even as Luciano continued to exert influence from behind bars for years afterward. The fall of Luciano sent a clear, unmistakable message throughout the New York underworld. No boss, however powerful, however well-connected, was truly untouchable. For a man like Gaetano Lucchese, who had spent his entire career cultivating discretion and minimizing his public exposure, Luciano's downfall served as a profound validation of everything he had instinctively understood about survival in this new and increasingly dangerous era. The old ways, the flashy displays of wealth, the public notoriety, the willingness to be photographed at nightclubs, surrounded by celebrities and starlets, as Luciano himself had often been, were no longer merely unnecessary risks. They were potentially fatal liabilities, the kind of visibility that eventually attracted exactly the sort of relentless prosecutorial attention that had brought down one of the most powerful men in American organized crime history. Gaetano doubled down on his own quiet approach. He avoided the nightclub circuit that so many of his contemporaries frequented. He kept his business dealings compartmentalized, layered through legitimate front companies and trusted intermediaries who could absorb legal scrutiny without the trail ever leading directly back to him. He cultivated a public image insofar as he had one at all of a modest, hardworking businessman, a man involved, on paper, in the garment trucking industry, in real estate, in a variety of legitimate-seeming enterprises that provided both income and, crucially, plausible deniability for the vastly more lucrative criminal operations running beneath the surface. This period also brought a significant personal dimension to Gaetano's life that historians and researchers have noted stood in contrast to the popular image of the ruthless, family-destroying gangster so often portrayed in fiction. Gaetano married Catherine Callow, and the couple would go on to raise a family together, including a son who, in one of the more poignant and complicated footnotes to Gaetano's story, would eventually attend West Point, the United States Military Academy, striking testament to the deep, almost desperate desire of many first- and second-generation immigrant crime bosses to secure for their own children the kind of unquestionable, all-American legitimacy and respectability that they themselves, through the choices they had made, could never fully claim. Gaetano, the man who had built an empire on extortion, gambling, and the careful management of violence, wanted nothing more than for his own children to walk a path entirely removed from the underworld that had defined his own existence. There is something genuinely poignant in this detail. Something that complicates the easy, cartoonish image of the mob boss as a man devoid of conflicting loyalties or deeper longing. Gaetano Lucchese was, by every account that survives him, a devoted family man in his private life, a man who compartmentalized his existence with the same rigorous discipline he applied to his criminal enterprises. One part of his life dedicated to the ruthless, calculated business of organized crime, and another part dedicated to providing his own children with opportunities and legitimacy that stood in stark, almost ironic contrast to the world that had made such opportunities possible in the first place. By the early 1940s, as the Second World War reshaped American society and briefly redirected the attention of both the public and law enforcement away from organized crime and toward the existential struggle overseas, Gaetano's position within Gagliano's family had grown to the point where he was widely understood, both within the organization and among the leadership of the other four families, to be the clear heir apparent, the man who would eventually succeed Gagliano as boss when the aging leader's tenure came to its natural end. Tommaso Gagliano, true to the cautious, low-profile philosophy that had defined his entire leadership, would go on to die of natural causes in 1951 at the age of 71, an extraordinarily rare fate for a man who had spent decades at the head of one of New York's most powerful crime families, having never been convicted of a major crime, having largely avoided the kind of public notoriety that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. In many ways, Gagliano's quiet, unremarkable death would serve as both a model and a validation for the man who succeeded him, proof that the philosophy Gaetano had embraced since his earliest days in the underworld, the philosophy of discretion over dominance, of patience over recklessness, could indeed carry a man not just to power, but through an entire lifetime of power, all the way to a peaceful end. But before that succession could take place, before Gaetano could formally assume control of the family that would eventually come to bear his own name in the history books, there remained years of careful positioning, of navigating the treacherous internal politics of the commission, of managing relationships with increasingly powerful and increasingly paranoid fellow bosses across the other four families, all while the shadow of federal and state law enforcement grew longer and more sophisticated with each passing year, as investigators slowly began to develop the tools, the wiretaps, and the informants that would eventually make even the most careful and discreet mob boss vulnerable in ways that Gaetano himself could scarcely have imagined during these formative years of his rise. The 1950s arrived in America wrapped in a strange and contradictory glow, a decade remembered, in popular imagination, for suburban prosperity, gleaming automobiles, and the quiet optimism of a nation that had won a world war and now believed itself entitled to peace and comfort. But beneath that gleaming surface, in the tenements and social clubs and back rooms of New York City, a different kind of history was unfolding, one that would forever alter the American public's understanding of organized crime and thrust men who had spent entire careers avoiding the spotlight into a harsh and unforgiving glare. When Tommaso Gagliano died quietly of natural causes in February 1951, the succession to leadership of the family passed to Gaetano Lucchese with a smoothness that itself spoke volumes about how thoroughly he had prepared for this moment. There was no war of succession, no bloody internal power struggle of the kind that had torn apart other families and organizations throughout the history of the American Mafia. Gaetano had spent 2 full decades cultivating loyalty, demonstrating competence, and building a network of relationships both within his own family and across the wider commission structure. And when the moment finally came, his ascension to boss felt, to those within the organization, less like a seizure of power and more like the simple, inevitable recognition of a role he had already been performing in every way but title for years. He was now approaching 50 years old, a man who had survived the Castellammarese War as a young lieutenant, who had watched Luciano rise and fall, who had built enormous, quiet wealth through the garment trucking rackets and labor racketeering that few outside the underworld even understood existed. And now, finally, he sat at the head of one of New York's 5 families, a position of extraordinary power, wielded, true to form, with almost no outward display whatsoever. Under Gaetano's leadership, The family's operations expanded and diversified even further, following the same philosophy of careful, patient diversification that had guided his rise. The garment industry rackets remained a core pillar of the family's income, but Gaetano pushed the organization deeper into other lucrative territories: labor union infiltration across multiple industries, illegal gambling operations that ranged from small neighborhood card games to larger, more sophisticated numbers rackets, loan sharking operations that preyed on desperate small businessmen and gamblers unable to secure legitimate credit, and increasingly, connections to legitimate businesses that provided both laundering mechanisms for illicit profits and plausible cover stories for a man whose true occupation, on paper, remained frustratingly difficult for investigators to pin down. But it was not simply the accumulation of rackets that defined Gaetano's leadership, it was the philosophy he brought to managing his organization, a philosophy that stood in increasingly stark contrast to some of his contemporaries across the other families, whose own leadership styles ranged from the erratic and paranoid to the openly aggressive. Gaetano ran his family the way a careful, conservative businessman might run a holding company. He avoided unnecessary violence whenever possible, understanding that every act of bloodshed carried with it not just moral risk, but practical, legal risk: witnesses, evidence, the attention of law enforcement. He preferred negotiation and quiet arrangement over open conflict, and when violence did become necessary, he ensured it was surgical, deniable, and carried out at enough remove from himself that no direct line could ever be drawn back to the man who had ordered it. This approach earned him a reputation, both within the underworld and eventually among the law enforcement agencies that studied him, as one of the most capable and dangerous strategic minds in the entire structure of American organized crime. Dangerous not because he was reckless, but precisely because he was not. Federal agents and prosecutors who spent years attempting to build cases against major mob bosses across the country would later admit, with a kind of grudging, professional respect, that Gaetano Lucchese represented one of the most frustrating targets they ever pursued, precisely because he left so little behind him. No boastful phone calls, no sloppy paper trails, no inner circle loose enough with their tongues to provide the kind of testimony that had brought down other bosses. It was also during this period that Gaetano became deeply enmeshed in the affairs of the broader commission, the governing body of the 5 families that Luciano had established in the aftermath of the Castellammarese War. As one of the more respected and level-headed bosses, Gaetano frequently found himself in the position of mediator, the man other bosses turned to when disputes threatened to spiral into the kind of open warfare that had once nearly destroyed the entire structure of organized crime in New York. His relationships with figures like Frank Costello, and later, with Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino, men whose own personalities and ambitions ran considerably hotter than his own, positioned him as a stabilizing force, a boss whose counsel carried weight precisely because he had no obvious personal agenda beyond the steady, quiet accumulation of wealth and the preservation of peace. This stabilizing influence would be tested severely as the 1950s wore on, particularly as tensions within the Genovese family, one of the other 5 families, began to escalate toward the kind of internal conflict that Gaetano had spent his entire career trying to avoid within his own organization. The rivalry between Frank Costello and the increasingly ambitious Vito Genovese, who coveted control of the family that technically still bore Luciano's structural legacy, even as Luciano himself remained exiled in Italy after his eventual deportation, would eventually erupt into violence that sent shockwaves through the entire underworld and critically drew exactly the kind of public and law enforcement attention that men like Gaetano had spent their entire careers trying to avoid. In May of 1957, Vito Genovese orchestrated an assassination attempt against Frank Costello, sending a gunman to ambush him in the lobby of his own apartment building. Costello survived, the bullet grazing rather than killing him, but the attack and Costello's subsequent decision to quietly step back from active leadership, rather than risk further bloodshed, signaled a dramatic and dangerous shift in the balance of power among the five families, with Genovese moving aggressively to consolidate control, not just of his own family, but of influence over the entire commission structure itself. Then, in October of that same year, came an even more shocking act of violence: the assassination of Albert Anastasia, the fearsome and volatile boss of what would later become known as the Gambino family, gunned down while sitting in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, in one of the most brazen and publicly visible mob killings in American history. The murder, almost certainly orchestrated with Genovese's involvement and the cooperation of Carlo Gambino, who would go on to assume leadership of Anastasia's family in the aftermath, sent an unmistakable message throughout the underworld and generated exactly the kind of sensational newspaper coverage that put organized crime and the very existence of a nationally coordinated mafia structure squarely in the public consciousness for the first time in years. For Gaetano, watching these events unfold from his own position of relative stability and quiet strength, the lesson was familiar and, by now, deeply ingrained. Violence, however satisfying, or however seemingly necessary in the moment, always carried consequences far beyond the immediate elimination of a rival. It generated headlines. It generated public pressure on politicians and prosecutors to be seen taking action. And in the specific, dangerous atmosphere of late 1957, it very nearly generated something far worse for the entire structure of American organized crime: a catastrophic and unprecedented exposure of the Mafia's national scope, an exposure that arrived not through the violence itself, but through what happened next. In November of 1957, in the small upstate New York town of Appalachian, law enforcement stumbled upon what would become one of the most famous and consequential events in the history of American organized crime: a gathering of dozens of high-ranking mob bosses from across the entire country, convened at the rural estate of Joseph Barbera, ostensibly to discuss and resolve the tensions that had been escalating within the Genovese and Anastasia Gambino conflicts, and more broadly, to address the growing instability threatening the commission's fragile peace. A local state trooper, suspicious of the unusual volume of expensive cars converging on the rural property, alerted colleagues, and law enforcement descended on the estate, resulting in the panicked, almost farcical spectacle of dozens of powerful, middle-aged and elderly mob bosses fleeing on foot through the surrounding woods and fields, many of them dressed in expensive suits entirely unsuited for cross-country flight, apprehended by state police as they emerged from the tree line. The Appalachian meeting, as it came to be known, was a public relations catastrophe for organized crime in America, providing definitive, undeniable proof captured in photographs and official records that a coordinated, national criminal organization did indeed exist, connecting bosses from New York to Chicago to Buffalo to Los Angeles in a shared structure of governance and mutual interest. It triggered a dramatic escalation in federal attention toward organized crime, providing crucial ammunition to a young Senate investigator named Robert Kennedy, whose work on the McClellan Committee investigating labor racketeering and organized crime would make his reputation and set the stage for the far more aggressive federal prosecution strategies that would define the 1960s. Remarkably, and in a detail that speaks profoundly to the caution and discretion that had defined his entire career, Gaetano Lucchese was not among the bosses apprehended at Appalachian. Accounts differ on the precise reason. Some historians suggest he simply had not yet arrived when the raid occurred. Others suggest his own instinctive caution led him to delay his arrival or reconsider attending entirely once he sensed something amiss with the gathering's security. Whatever the precise explanation, the outcome was entirely consistent with the pattern that had defined his entire life. While dozens of his fellow bosses found themselves photographed, fingerprinted, and permanently, publicly identified as organized crime figures in a scandal that would follow them for the rest of their careers, Gaetano Lucchese once again remained in the shadows. His name, mentioned in subsequent investigations and reports, but his personal exposure minimized, in a way that few of his contemporaries could claim. The years immediately following Appalachian brought an entirely new and more dangerous era for organized crime in America, as the revelations from that failed meeting fueled congressional investigations, expanded FBI attention under an increasingly reluctant J. Edgar Hoover, who had, for decades, publicly downplayed the existence of a coordinated national mafia structure and set the stage for the far more sophisticated and aggressive prosecutorial strategies that Robert Kennedy would bring to bear as Attorney General under his brother's administration in the early 1960s. For Gaetano, now firmly established as boss of his family and one of the most respected elder statesmen of the entire commission structure, this new era demanded an even more rigorous application of the discretion and caution that had defined his entire career. He watched as contemporaries across other families fell to indictments, to congressional subpoenas, to the mounting weight of federal attention that Appalachian had unleashed. And through it all, he continued to build his own family's operations with the same patient, unglamorous consistency that had carried him from a tenement childhood in East Harlem to the head of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history, always calculating, always several steps removed from the violence and publicity that destroyed so many of his peers, quietly consolidating an empire that would ultimately prove to be one of the most durable in the entire history of American organized crime. What lay ahead in the turbulent 1960 seconds would test even Gaetano's legendary caution, as the full weight of the Kennedy Justice Department's war on organized crime descended upon the American Mafia, and as new threats from ambitious young rivals within his own ranks to increasingly sophisticated law enforcement surveillance techniques began to close in around even the most careful and calculating of the old guard bosses. If the Appalachian disaster of 1957 had cracked open the American public's understanding of organized crime, then the 1960s would blow that crack wide open into a chasm. And at the center of the storm sat a Justice Department more determined, better funded, and more personally invested in destroying the Mafia than any before it. When John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in January of 1961, he brought with him his younger brother Robert as Attorney General, a man who had spent years as chief counsel to the McClellan Committee, who had personally interrogated dozens of mob figures and union racketeers, and who arrived at the Justice Department with something rare among American law enforcement officials of the era: genuine, burning conviction that organized crime represented not merely a series of isolated local problems, but a coordinated, national conspiracy that demanded a coordinated, national response. For Gaetano Lucchese, now in his late 50s, and firmly established as one of the most respected and enduring bosses within the five-family structure, the Kennedy years represented a fundamental shift in the risk calculus that had governed his entire career. The old assumptions that local police corruption could be managed, that federal attention could largely be avoided through sufficient discretion, that the FBI's own institutional skepticism about the existence of a national mafia would continue to limit the Bureau's investigative appetite. All of these assumptions began to crumble under the weight of Robert Kennedy's relentless institutional pressure. Kennedy expanded the Justice Department's organized crime and racketeering section, pushed for expanded wiretapping authority, and coordinated more aggressively than any attorney general before him with the Internal Revenue Service, using tax investigations as a tool to pursue mob figures whose criminal enterprises otherwise left frustratingly little direct evidence. Gaetano responded to this new environment the way he had responded to every challenge throughout his career: by doubling down on caution, by further compartmentalizing his operations, and by relying increasingly on a small, deeply trusted inner circle of lieutenants and associates who understood, without needing to be told twice, the absolute necessity of discretion in an era when even a single loose word could theoretically be captured by an FBI wiretap and used to build a racketeering case that might otherwise have taken years to construct through more traditional investigative means. He avoided phones for anything of substance. He conducted sensitive business face to face, often on foot, on the theory increasingly grounded in genuine paranoia rather than mere caution that walking conversations were far harder for law enforcement to surveil than conversations conducted in cars, offices, or homes that might already be wired. This heightened vigilance proved remarkably effective, at least in the short term, but the broader structure of American organized crime was about to suffer a blow far more devastating than any single prosecution, wiretap, or congressional hearing, a blow that would come not from outside the Mafia's ranks, but from within, delivered by a man whose testimony would finally provide the American public and the American government with the single most detailed, comprehensive account of the Mafia's internal structure, rituals, and operations that had ever been made public. Joseph Valachi was a low-level soldier in the Genovese family, a man of limited standing and limited prospects within the broader hierarchy of organized crime, who found himself imprisoned and under the mounting pressure of a mistaken belief that his own boss, Vito Genovese, had ordered his murder while both men were incarcerated together, made the fateful decision to cooperate extensively with federal investigators. In 1963, Valachi testified before the McClellan Committee in televised hearings that captivated and horrified the American public, providing the first detailed public account of the Mafia's internal structure, its formal induction ceremonies, its chain of command, from soldier to capo to underboss to boss, and crucially, the very term by which its members referred to their own organization, Cosa Nostra, our thing, a phrase that would enter the American popular lexicon permanently in the wake of Valachi's revelations, for men like Gaetano Lucchese, who had spent entire careers ensuring that even the existence of a coordinated national criminal organization remained a matter of speculation and denial rather than confirmed public fact. The Valachi hearings represented a devastating and irreversible breach. The mystique of invisibility, the carefully maintained ambiguity that had allowed bosses across the country to operate for decades while their own communities and much of the broader American public remained genuinely uncertain about the true scope and structure of what they were dealing with. All of it evaporated under the glare of television cameras and the detailed, methodical testimony of a disgruntled, frightened soldier from a rival family. Fortunately for Gaetano personally, Valachi's direct knowledge was limited primarily to the Genovese family, within which he had served, and his testimony, while devastating to the Mafia's broader public mystique, provided relatively little direct, actionable evidence against Gaetano's own organization, specifically, once again, the compartmentalized, cautious structure that Gaetano had spent decades building, a structure in which even trusted lieutenants often possessed only limited need-to-know information about the broader operations of the family, proved its worth, insulating him from the kind of direct exposure that devastated other bosses and organizations in the years following Valachi's testimony. But the broader damage to organized crime's operating environment was undeniable and permanent. The Valachi hearings, combined with the sustained institutional pressure of the Kennedy Justice Department, marked the beginning of a fundamentally new era in the relationship between American law enforcement and organized crime. An era defined by increasingly sophisticated federal investigative techniques, expanded use of informants and cooperating witnesses, and eventually, the development of entirely new legal tools, including the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, signed into law in 1970, which would provide prosecutors with unprecedented ability to target entire criminal organizations as coordinated conspiracies, rather than pursuing individual crimes in isolation. Even as these external pressures mounted, Gaetano found himself, in the mid-1960s, drawn into perhaps the most dangerous and destabilizing internal conflict of his entire career as a boss, a conflict that would test not just his caution and discretion, but his skill as a strategist and mediator within the delicate, often fractious politics of the commission itself. The crisis centered on Joseph Bonanno, boss of the Bonanno family, one of the original 5 families, whose escalating ambitions and increasingly erratic behavior had begun to alarm his fellow bosses across the commission structure. Bonanno, according to accounts that emerged from FBI surveillance and later corroborated by various informants, had developed an ambitious and deeply destabilizing plan to eliminate several of his rival bosses, including, according to some accounts, Gaetano Lucchese himself, along with Carlo Gambino, in a bid to dramatically expand his own family's power and influence within the commission structure. When this plot was discovered, or at least strongly suspected, by the other bosses, it triggered what would come to be known as the Banana War, referencing Bonanno's own surname, a period of internal mafia conflict throughout the mid-1960s, marked by internal power struggles within the Bonanno family itself, as rival factions battled for control amid Joseph Bonanno's increasingly tenuous grip on his own organization. Gaetano, alongside Gambino, played a central role in the commission's response to the Bonanno crisis, working to isolate Bonanno, to support rival factions within his family who sought to remove him from power, and ultimately to manage the fallout of a conflict that threatened, at various points, to spill over into the kind of open, citywide warfare that the commission structure had been specifically designed to prevent. It was a period that showcased Gaetano's particular genius as a strategist within the underworld's internal politics, not the genius of a man who sought to eliminate rivals through direct violence, but the genius of a man who understood how to build coalitions, how to isolate a dangerous or destabilizing figure through patient political maneuvering rather than open conflict, and how to manage a crisis in a way that preserved the broader stability of the entire criminal ecosystem within which his own family's fortunes remained deeply intertwined. Bonanno himself would eventually be effectively pushed out of active leadership of his own family, disappearing for a period under circumstances that remain debated among historians, some accounts suggesting a genuine, self-imposed exile as he recognized the untenability of his position, others suggesting a more coerced departure orchestrated by rivals both within his own family and across the broader commission. Whatever the precise mechanics, the Banana War gradually subsided by the late 1960s, leaving the commission structure battered but intact, and leaving Gaetano Lucchese's own reputation, if anything, further enhanced as one of the underworld's most capable and trusted senior statesmen, a man other bosses turned to not merely for business advice, but for the kind of careful, strategic political judgment that could mean the difference between manageable internal disputes and catastrophic, structure-threatening warfare. By the close of the 1960s, Gaetano Lucchese stood as one of the longest-serving and most respected bosses in the entire history of the American Mafia, a man who had survived the Castellammarese War as a young lieutenant, who had built an empire through the patient accumulation of labor rackets and garment industry extortion rather than headline-grabbing violence, who had watched Luciano rise and fall, who had avoided the humiliation of Appalachian, who had weathered the devastating public exposure of the Valachi hearings with his own organization largely intact, and who had played a central, stabilizing role in resolving one of the most dangerous internal conflicts the Commission had ever faced. He was, by any measure, one of the most successful organized crime figures in American history. Not successful in the sense of accumulating the most spectacular personal notoriety, but successful in the far rarer and more difficult sense of building and sustaining genuine, lasting power across nearly 4 decades without ever once serving significant prison time, without ever being definitively linked through admissible evidence to the violence that had undoubtedly been necessary, at various points, to secure and maintain his position. But even the most careful and disciplined man cannot escape the passage of time forever. And as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, a new and far more personal threat began to emerge, one that no amount of discretion, no careful compartmentalization of criminal operations, no skillful navigation of commission politics could ultimately outmaneuver or delay. Gaetano Lucchese, the quiet don who had spent his entire life staying several careful steps ahead of prosecutors, informants, and rival bosses alike, was about to face an adversary that had never once been successfully evaded by any man in human history. There is a peculiar cruelty in the way history sometimes arranges its endings. And for Gaetano Lucchese, the man who had spent nearly 5 decades outmaneuvering rival gangsters, federal prosecutors, congressional investigators, and the internal treacheries of his own underworld, the final adversary would arrive not with guns or grand juries, but silently, invisibly growing inside his own skull. Indifferent to every ounce of caution and discretion, he had spent his entire life perfecting. By the mid-1960s, Gaetano was well into his 60s, a man whose physical presence had, by all accounts, grown somewhat stouter and grayer with the passing years, but whose mind remained as sharp and calculating as it had been during the desperate, blood-soaked days of the Castellammarese War decades earlier. He continued to run his family with the same steady hand, continued to sit as one of the most respected voices on the commission, continued to be sought out by his fellow bosses for counsel during moments of crisis. To the outside world, and even to many within his own organization, there was no indication that anything was amiss. No sign that the Quiet Don's extraordinary run of survival and success was approaching its final chapter. The first signs, when they came, were subtle in the way that the beginnings of serious illness so often are. The kind of symptoms easy to dismiss, easy to attribute to simple fatigue, or the ordinary aches and diminishments that accompany advancing age. Headaches, perhaps more persistent and severe than the ordinary variety. Moments of disorientation or difficulty concentrating that could just as easily have been explained away by the stress of a life spent constantly calculating risk, constantly managing the delicate, exhausting politics of an organization that depended entirely on his continued vigilance and judgment. For a man who had built his entire existence around never revealing weakness, around maintaining an impenetrable facade of calm control even in the most dangerous circumstances, it would have been entirely in character for Gaetano to have minimized or concealed whatever early symptoms he experienced, to have continued conducting business as though nothing at all were wrong, even as something was, in fact, growing steadily and irreversibly wrong within him. Eventually, however, the symptoms became impossible to ignore or explain away, and Gaetano was diagnosed with a brain tumor, a diagnosis that, in the medical landscape of the 1960s, carried none of the incremental hope that decades of subsequent advances in oncology and neurosurgery would eventually provide to patients facing similar conditions. Brain tumors in this era were, in the vast majority of cases, a death sentence, treatable only through crude surgical intervention and radiation therapies that offered limited effectiveness and came with their own devastating physical costs. And Gaetano, for all his wealth, for all his power, for all the fear and respect his name commanded throughout the criminal underworld of New York City, found himself facing an opponent that no amount of money, connections, or careful strategic calculation could ultimately defeat. There is something almost unbearably human in imagining this moment in Gaetano's life, a man who had spent his entire adult existence as one of the most feared and respected figures in American organized crime, man who had ordered violence, who had built an empire through extortion and intimidation, who had navigated some of the bloodiest and most treacherous internal conflicts in Mafia history, now confronting the same fundamental vulnerability that awaits every human being, regardless of power or position. All the careful compartmentalization that had protected him from federal prosecutors for decades meant nothing against a tumor that recognized no jurisdiction, respected no code of silence, and could not be intimidated, bribed, or outmaneuvered through patient political calculation. According to accounts from those who knew him during this period, Gaetano approached his illness with much the same discipline and controlled composure that had defined his entire career. He did not, by most accounts, allow his diagnosis to become public knowledge any more than was strictly necessary, continuing to project an image of strength and continuity to an organization that depended on stability at its highest levels. even as his own physical condition began the slow, cruel process of deterioration. This was, in its own way, entirely consistent with everything that had defined him throughout his life. The same instinct toward discretion that had kept him out of prison for nearly 5 decades now applied to the far more intimate and unwinnable battle being fought within his own body. As's condition progressively worsened through the mid to late 1960s. Questions of succession inevitably began to occupy increasing attention within the upper echelons of the family, even as Gaetano himself remained, formally, the boss. This period required exactly the kind of careful, behind-the-scenes management that Gaetano had spent his entire career perfecting, ensuring that the transition of power, whenever it ultimately came, would proceed smoothly, without the kind of destabilizing internal conflict that had torn apart other families during moments of leadership crisis, without providing an opening for external rivals or overly ambitious internal figures to exploit a moment of perceived weakness at the top of the organization. The man increasingly relied upon during this period of transition was Carmine Tremonti, a trusted figure within the family who would eventually step into a position of greater authority as Gaetano's health continued its irreversible decline. Alongside other senior figures within the organization's hierarchy who understood, even if it remained largely unspoken, that they were witnessing the final chapter of one of the most remarkable careers in the history of American organized crime. Throughout this period, even as his own mortality pressed in around him with the same silent, inexorable pressure of the tumor itself, Gaetano continued, insofar as his health allowed, to maintain his role within the broader commission structure. His counsel still valued, his decades of accumulated wisdom and strategic judgment still sought out by fellow bosses navigating their own crises and conflicts. There is a particular poignancy in imagining a man of his stature, a man who had survived so much, continuing to show up, continuing to offer guidance and stability to an organization and a broader criminal ecosystem that had come to depend on his steady presence, even as he understood, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism that had defined every other aspect of his life, exactly what awaited him. The physical toll of the illness, as it progressed, would have been severe and increasingly difficult to conceal. Brain tumors of the type Gaetano suffered from often bring with them not just physical symptoms, weakness, seizures, difficulty with speech or motor coordination, but also profound cognitive and personality changes, as the growing mass disrupts the delicate neurological architecture responsible for memory, judgment, and personality itself. For a man whose entire life and legacy had been built upon the sharpness of his mind, upon his extraordinary capacity for careful, patient strategic calculation, the prospect of that same mind gradually being compromised and diminished by the disease growing within it represents perhaps the cruelest possible irony available to a life defined so completely by intelligence and discretion. Gaetano Lucchese died on July 13, 1967, at his home in Lido Beach, New York, succumbing finally to the brain tumor that had spent the preceding months and years slowly overtaking a body and mind that had, for nearly 5 decades, proven so remarkably resistant to every other threat the world had thrown against them. He was 64 years old, and in his death, just as in his life, there was a profound and almost poetic consistency with everything that had defined him. He died not in a hail of gunfire, in some dramatic, cinematic gangland assassination, not in a federal prison cell, after a lifetime of failed appeals, not in the humiliating custody of law enforcement officials who had finally, after decades of trying, managed to build a case sufficient to convict him. He died in his own bed, surrounded by family, having never once been convicted of the countless serious crimes that had built the empire he left behind. A death so quiet, so private, so utterly devoid of the drama and spectacle that had characterized the deaths of so many of his contemporaries throughout the history of American organized crime, that it stands, even now, as perhaps the single most remarkable achievement of his entire extraordinary career. Consider the contrast with the men who had shaped his rise and defined the era through which he lived. Giuseppe Masseria, gunned down over a card game in a Coney Island restaurant. Salvatore Maranzano, shot to death at his own desk by gunmen posing as government officials. Albert Anastasia, murdered in a barber's chair in one of the most sensational assassinations in American criminal history. Even Lucky Luciano, arguably the single most influential figure in shaping the modern structure of American organized crime, had spent years in prison before his eventual deportation to Italy, dying in relative exile, far from the city and the empire he had helped build. Against this backdrop of violence, imprisonment, and public disgrace, Gaetano Lucchese's quiet death from natural causes, at home, surrounded by the family he had spent his entire life trying to shield from the criminal world that had provided their wealth and comfort, represents something genuinely extraordinary. A testament to a philosophy of quiet, patient, disciplined power that had allowed him to survive and thrive through nearly 5 decades of the most turbulent and dangerous period in the entire history of American organized crime. News of his death, when it reached the public, generated far less sensational coverage than might have been expected for a man of his actual stature and influence within the underworld. Itself a final, fitting testament to the extraordinary success of the discretion he had cultivated throughout his entire life. He was not, to the broader American public, a household name in the way that Al Capone or Lucky Luciano had become. Most ordinary New Yorkers, reading the modest newspaper accounts of his passing, would have had little sense that they were reading about the death of a man who had, for over 3 decades, sat among the most powerful criminal figures in the entire history of the United States. A man whose decisions and strategic judgment had shaped the internal politics of organized crime through some of its most volatile and dangerous periods. His funeral, by contrast, told a different story to those who understood what they were witnessing. A gathering that brought together figures from across the underworld. Men who understood, even if the broader public did not, exactly what had been lost with his passing. Not merely a boss, but one of the last remaining links to the founding generation of the modern American Mafia. A man who had been present at the very creation of the commission structure itself, who had witnessed and participated in the transformation of Italian-American organized crime from the chaotic, blood-soaked conflicts of the Castellammarese War into the more stable, businesslike criminal enterprise that would define the decades to follow. In the aftermath of his death, leadership of the family passed formally to Carmine Tramonti, continuing the organization's remarkable, decades-long pattern of relatively smooth leadership transitions, itself a lasting legacy of the careful, stability-focused approach to power that Gaetano had cultivated throughout his entire tenure as boss. The family that had once been known by Gagliano's name, and before that by Reina's, would eventually come to be known permanently by Gaetano's own surname, the Lucchese crime family, a name that endures to this day, carried forward across subsequent decades and subsequent generations of leadership, long after the man himself had passed from the world. A permanent testament etched into the very structure and nomenclature of American organized crime history, to the quiet, patient, extraordinarily disciplined life of the boy who had once been a poor Sicilian immigrant with 2 missing fingers, growing up in the tenements of East Harlem, dreaming, perhaps, of nothing more than survival, and building, in the end, one of the most enduring criminal empires in American history. What remains, in the final accounting of Gaetano Lucchese's extraordinary life, is the question of legacy. What his decades of quiet, calculated power ultimately meant, both for the organization he left behind and for the broader understanding of what it truly took to survive, and even thrive, at the very pinnacle of one of the most dangerous and unforgiving worlds in American history. That final reckoning, and the story of what became of the empire he built after his passing, awaits us in the concluding chapter of this remarkable story. In the years that followed Gaetano Lucchese's death in the summer of 1967, the empire he had spent nearly 5 decades building would continue to evolve, adapt, and in many ways, struggle to replicate the extraordinary combination of discipline, discretion, and strategic patience that had defined his own singular tenure at its head. It is one of the enduring truths of organized crime history. Indeed, perhaps of institutional history more broadly, that the qualities which allow a single, extraordinary individual to build and sustain power over decades are rarely fully transferable to the successors who follow. However carefully the transition itself might be managed, Carmine Tremonti, who assumed formal leadership of the family in the immediate aftermath of Gaetano's death, inherited an organization at the very height of its power and influence, deeply entrenched across the garment industry, labor unions, gambling operations, and the broader web of legitimate and illegitimate enterprises that Gaetano had spent decades carefully constructing. But Tremonti's own tenure would prove considerably more turbulent and considerably shorter than his predecessors, as the family navigated an increasingly hostile law enforcement environment shaped by the very legal and investigative innovations that had begun accelerating during the final years of Gaetano's own leadership, the expanded wiretapping authorities, the aggressive new prosecutorial strategies born from the Kennedy Justice Department's institutional legacy, and eventually, the devastating new weapon that federal prosecutors would wield against organized crime throughout the 1970s and beyond, the RICO Act, which finally provided the legal architecture necessary to prosecute entire criminal organizations as coordinated conspiracies, dismantling in a single sweeping indictment what individual, piecemeal prosecutions had failed to accomplish across decades of previous effort. Tremonti himself would eventually be convicted on narcotics trafficking charges in the early 1970s, a conviction that stood in stark, almost symbolic contrast to Gaetano's own extraordinary 5-decade record of evading serious legal consequence, and one that seemed to confirm what many observers of organized crime had begun to suspect, that the particular set of circumstances, historical timing, and individual genius for discretion that had allowed Gaetano Lucchese to build and sustain his empire without ever facing serious prosecution represented not simply good fortune, but the product of an extraordinarily specific set of skills and judgment that few of his successors, in this dramatically transformed legal and investigative landscape, would ever be able to fully replicate. The Lucchese family would continue on through subsequent decades, under a succession of later bosses, weathering the increasingly aggressive prosecutorial campaigns of the 1980s and 1992 that would eventually see numerous high-ranking figures across all 5 families convicted and imprisoned under RICO and related statutes, campaigns that fundamentally transformed the landscape of American organized crime and brought an end to the relatively stable, low-visibility era that families like Gaetano's had enjoyed throughout the middle decades of the 20th century. The family survived, as organizations often do, but it never again achieved quite the same combination of quiet, expansive power that had characterized Gaetano's own extraordinary tenure at its helm. What, then, are we to make of Gaetano Lucchese's life, viewed now across the full arc of nearly a century of distance and historical perspective? It would be easy, and in some ways tempting, to romanticize a figure like Gaetano, to focus on the remarkable discipline, the strategic brilliance, the almost unbelievable achievement of building and sustaining a criminal empire across nearly 5 decades without ever facing serious legal consequence, and to frame this as a kind of admirable, even inspirational story of an immigrant boy who overcame poverty and physical disadvantage to achieve extraordinary success against tremendous odds. There is undeniably something genuinely remarkable about his story, something that speaks to qualities of patience, intelligence, and self-discipline that would have been valued and celebrated in almost any legitimate field of human endeavor, but it would be a profound disservice to the full truth of his life, and to the countless individuals harmed by the empire he built, to allow that admiration for his strategic brilliance to obscure the fundamental reality of what that empire actually was and what it actually cost. Every dollar extracted through the garment industry extortion rackets that formed one of the core pillars of Gaetano's wealth represented money taken, ultimately, from small manufacturers and their workers, from an industry already operating on thin margins, through threats and intimidation dressed in the language of legitimate business services. Every loan issued through the family's loan sharking operations represented a desperate individual, often already in dire financial straits, pushed further into a cycle of debt and fear from which escape was often functionally impossible, enforced through the constant, unspoken threat of violence that underpinned the entire structure of organized crime lending. Every labor union infiltrated and controlled represented workers whose collective bargaining power, ostensibly meant to protect their interests against exploitative employers, was instead quietly redirected to serve the interests of the criminal organization that had seized control of their union's leadership. And beneath the surface of Gaetano's carefully cultivated public image as a discreet, low-key businessman, there remained the fundamental, inescapable reality that his rise and his sustained power depended, as it did for every mob boss of his era, on the ever-present threat and periodic reality of violence that he himself may have rarely, if ever, carried out personally in his later years as boss, but violence that was nonetheless carried out on his authority, in service of his interests, throughout his entire career. The very qualities that make his story so compelling from a narrative and historical perspective, the discretion, the patience, the strategic brilliance were, in the end, simply more sophisticated and more effective tools in service of the same fundamental enterprise that defined every organized crime figure of his era: the systematic extraction of wealth and power through fear, intimidation, and the credible threat of violence. Operating entirely outside the bounds of legitimate law and civil society, there is also a genuine and important historical dimension to Gaetano's story that extends beyond his own individual career, one that speaks to the broader immigrant experience in early 20th century America and the complicated, often tragic circumstances that pushed so many talented, ambitious young men from communities like East Harlem's Italian immigrant enclave toward organized crime rather than legitimate paths to success. Gaetano Lucchese was, by every account, a man of genuine intelligence, discipline, and strategic acumen, qualities that, had he been born into different circumstances, had he faced a legitimate business or professional world less closed off to Italian immigrants by the pervasive discrimination and limited opportunity of his era, might have carried him to success and respectability through entirely legal means. This is not offered as an excuse or justification for the choices he made and the harm his empire caused, but rather as an important piece of historical context that helps explain, without excusing, how a specific set of social and economic circumstances in early 20th century America created conditions in which organized crime became, for so many ambitious young immigrants, one of the very few pathways toward the wealth, respect, and security that legitimate society so often denied them. It is worth returning these final reflections to that small but genuinely poignant detail from Gaetano's personal life: his evident desire to see his own children achieve the kind of unquestionable, legitimate American success that his own path through organized crime, however successful, in its own dark terms, could never fully provide. A son who attended West Point represents, in its own quiet way, perhaps the truest measure of what Gaetano Lucchese actually understood about the nature of the empire he built, that for all its wealth, for all its power, for all the fear and respect his name commanded throughout the New York underworld, it remained fundamentally a criminal enterprise, built on a foundation that could never provide his own family with the kind of secure, legitimate future that he apparently wanted for them above all else. The quiet don who spent his entire adult life building power in the shadows seems, in this light, to have understood something that perhaps only a man who had lived his entire existence just beyond the reach of the law could fully appreciate: that the empire he built, however successfully he managed to protect it and himself throughout his own lifetime, was never something he wished to pass on intact to his own children. He wanted them out. He wanted them legitimate. He wanted them, in the end, to inherit the wealth and security his criminal career had provided, without inheriting the criminal career itself. Perhaps this, in the final analysis, is the most human and most genuinely revealing detail available to us in the entire remarkable story of Gaetano Lucchese, a man who built one of the most successful and enduring criminal empires in American history, who navigated nearly 5 decades of war, betrayal, federal prosecution, congressional investigation, and the constant, grinding pressure of maintaining power in one of the most dangerous and unforgiving worlds available to any American of his era, and who, in the end, wanted nothing more for his own children than the chance to live an entirely different kind of life. The Quiet Dawn, it turns out, understood the true cost of the quiet empire he had built better than almost anyone. Well enough, in fact, to spend his entire life trying to ensure that the people he loved most would never have to pay that cost themselves. Gaetano Lucchese died as he had lived, quietly, without spectacle, have outlasted nearly every rival and contemporary who had once stood alongside him at the founding of the modern American Mafia. He left behind no dramatic final showdown, no cinematic downfall, no prison sentence to mark the end of his criminal career for history's record. He left behind, instead, an organization that bore his name for decades afterward, a family that, by his own evident design, moved beyond the world that had made his own fortune possible, and a legacy that endures today, largely as a case study studied by historians, by law enforcement agencies, by anyone seeking to understand exactly what it took for a single man to build and sustain extraordinary criminal power across one of the most turbulent and dangerous eras in American history, and to do so almost entirely in the shadows, almost entirely unseen, right up until the very end. In a world of gangsters who craved the spotlight, who believed that fame itself was a form of protection, Gaetano Lucchese understood something far more dangerous and far more enduring, that true power does not announce itself. It does not need to. It simply persists, quietly, patiently, for as long as those who hold it have the discipline never to let the world see exactly how much of it they truly possess.